Welcome to Guy Code, a podcast dedicated to imparting dad wisdom to my son, with your host, Koji Steven Sakai, and friends.
Alrighty, welcome. This is Koji, and this is episode number 51. I wanted to impart all my wisdom to my son, but of course, my son already thinks he knows more than me. So instead of trying to tell him now and having it go in one ear and out the other ear, I decided to record them here in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, when he's ready and when he's older, he'll listen to my advice in the future, not make the same stupid mistakes I made. I'll also bring on guests like today to impart their wisdom as well. I have no doubt that their advice will be better than my advice. This week, I brought on actor Roji Oyama. Roji, how are you?
Good to see you, Steven.
It's good to see you.
Son.
Thank you. Why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Well, I am shin-issei, which means that I'm actually third generation, but I was born to Nisei parents in Japan, and spent my formidable years there till about 8 years of age before we repatriated back to the United States. I was enrolled in a Japanese school, kindergarten, and then enrolled to an international school. So my parents felt it was very important for me to be exposed to diversity from a very young age. And so consequently, that was the start of my life in Japan. And, I think it's kind of molded my mindset as to who I take on as friends, and always had an open mind, to everything new. So we lived in Japan for 8 years and then moved back to the United States. And interestingly enough, coming back to the United States, not coming to the United States for me for the first time, it was the first time I faced discrimination, racial discrimination. Interestingly, and not only from Caucasians, but from Japanese Americans.
Yeah. And
this all kind of, came on in judo school. So I don't know, do you want to ask me something else here, Stephen? Or
No.
Keep rolling.
You can keep talking. I'm interested in what you're saying.
Yeah, and so these kids tease me because I asked them why they didn't speak Japanese. And they said, well, we're American. We don't have to do that kind of thing. I said, but aren't you proud of who you are? And it's important to speak Japanese. And with that, a kid punched me in the mouth, right? And so I related that story to my parents, and he said, well, unfortunately, it's a growing up Japanese American. They didn't have any experience in Japan, so you have to kind of understand that they don't have that perspective, so try to be understanding. Well, I went back the next day and found the guy and punched him back. So I got called into the principal's office, and my parents really weren't too happy about that. But it was really quite a shock. It's a double shock of racial discrimination, seeing graffiti and being outed in school classrooms, and I had a hard time adjusting to that. Plus, I was also there's a diagnosis ADD, right? Attention deficit disorder.
Yeah.
So I had to deal with that whole issue. But went through junior high school and into high school here, graduated San Francisco, but kind of was sort of separated from the Japanese American community. And I found comfort in other nationalities and friendships because they didn't really judge me the same way I was being judged by my own community members, so to speak. And I just happened to be in high school when the Summer of Love broke out in San Francisco, 1965. And so that was a big turning point in my life. I had my eyes open to the counterculture. And I was already kind of a heretic as far as the Japanese American community is concerned. But when I went and dropped out all the way, then I became counterculture all the way, grew my hair out, pretty much became a hippie and a political activist in high school. The Vietnam War was on. So I became an anti-war activist, and that kind of morphed into graduating and going to San Francisco State. So I was part of the San Francisco State strike in 1968.
Oh wow! Okay, I was going to ask you about that. Okay.
Yeah. So that was pretty momentous in history as we look back on it now. 51 years, we changed the course of education, helped change the course of education in the city. So the state college was closed down for almost a year after. So I had no place to school, and I had been working summer jobs as a carpenter building houseboats in Sausalito, which was great fun. So I had beginning and learning of a trade and a part-time job. And so I, had an old junky Volvo car that I drove around. I sold it, cashed it in, bought a one-way ticket to Europe. And I decided I was going to hitchhike I landed in Holland in Amsterdam, and I was going to hitchhike all the way to Japan. That was my goal.
Okay.
But the journey started in Northern Europe, and I kind of, lived out on my backpack and slept in fields and slept in hostels when I felt like luxuriating myself, and had an amazing time. I was on the road for 4 months and got as far as Turkey, Eastern Turkey, and then had to turn back because I didn't really communicate back then. There was no internet. The only way was to have people send me general delivery letters at some capital, big city, at the post office, and it's in French it's called poste restante. You just go there and you give your name, and if there's something there, you get it. So I got a telegram actually from the United States, and my mom had sent me a telegram saying that you are wanted by the Selective Service Board. They found that you dropped out of school, and you now are being drafted to go to Vietnam. So I sat there in top of this rooftop hostel in Istanbul. I got back to Istanbul is where I got the telegram, and I'm looking at this beautiful blue mosque and had a nice big bowl of hash and was trying to contemplate, okay, what am I going to do? Should I go home or should I just ignore it and move on? Well, luckily, while I was staying at the hostel, I met a lawyer, kind of a hippie lawyer guy, and he said, well, if you keep going, here's what can happen is your name will be put out into Interpol. And if I happen to pass through a country with my passport that has extradition treaty with the United States, I would be arrested on the spot and sent home, and then it's game over. I would be a Dodge driver. So I hemmed and hawed, and finally I called home, and I had talked to my one. I said, is anybody calling? He says, yeah, they've been calling, looking for you, but I said that you're traveling. So I said, good. Well, but she said that you better get home. This looks pretty serious. And she said there was a stack of letters from the government demanding that I show up for a hearing. So I went home, I got home, and I actually faced the draft board. Before I went, I wasn't a great student, but I probably wrote the greatest paper of my life, stating my reasons and quoting philosophers and religious and political person as speaking to the issue of, objection to war.
Yeah.
So I was all ready to go into the hearing, and I got there, and there were like three supposed, I guess they're judges, sitting up on this high desk, and I come to the podium. Now, one of them looked at me when I walked in the room, and I kind of cleared my throat. And one of them, without looking up, said, okay, what do you have to say? So I opened up my paper, which was probably 10 pages long. I got through the first page, and they said, well, that's enough. We've heard enough. You're dismissed. I go, well, wait a minute. I really have a lot to say about this issue. They said, it doesn't matter. Just hand it in and we'll review it, and you'll hear from us. So I handed in and I left. And in the meantime, I got called for an induction physical. So I had to go to Oakland Army Terminal, and I had to go get, a physical, right? And so I met one guy there. He was giggling and something, and he was high on psychedelic drugs. And he said, I'm going to go pretend to be crazy. I heard that you can get crazy and get out of the draft. I said, yeah. Okay, good luck, man. So to make a long story short, what happened was I had gotten a medical deferment because I had really bad allergies, skin allergies when I was a kid. So this whole thing ended with an anticlimactic ending. I got a medical deferment. I didn't get a political deferment. So, okay, so that was done.
Can I just note real quick that I'm actually on the California board, or the Selective Service Board now.
Oh yeah, okay. That's all right. The case was closed. It was a long time ago. That's ancient history. I'm all good with that.
Okay.
So, that kind of finished off. And so here I was back in the States, and I said, okay, that's time to go back to school. And, left my education kind of dangling, and I only had first year. So I decided to keep pursuing fine arts. I love photography, and I was studying sort of cultural anthropology as a minor. So I ended up getting a partial scholarship to the San Francisco Art Institute here, and was able to start studying photography and graphics. And then I proposed to get an independent study program, which I wanted to go back to Japan. And I had this urge after my 4-month trip on the road to still kind of looking to find out who I was, and whether I should go back to Japan. Maybe I can fit in and be there and live as a Japanese. So I did that and moved to Tokyo and had to relearn the language. I totally forgot my language within 3 months, but ever studying every day, 3 months at a Buddhist temple, every morning at 7 a.m., I was able to get my language back. It was almost like there was recall. It came back. And it was interesting because counterculture was just starting to happen in Japan. And here I was, California hippie. I was just ready to be the introducer of counterculture to a lot of the friends I made in Japan. And it was great fun. There was the social cultural revolution was starting to happen in Japan. Japanese fashion was coming up. The bubble economy was just starting to happen. I think Japanese fashion exploded with Kenzo opening up his store in Paris. So later, fashion luminaries such as Roji Yamamoto, let's see, I'm trying to remember, Yamamoto Kansai, these are young, they were young guys who were all hanging out together, right? And Yamamoto Kansai says, hey, do you have any weed, So I said, yeah, that's some weed. So I brought weed to Japan, and we were all kind of hanging out, smoking weed. And all these people just went on to become mega famous, and they were musicians. So that was the nucleus of Japanese culture. I'm really lucky to be there right at that time.
Yeah.
And after 3 years, I just, I found out, well, I'm not, I don't think I can really stay in Japan. I was just a little too on the edge for Japanese society. A lot of my friends who became hippified, they left. They went to London, they came to New York. And so I got kind of lonely. I said, well, it's time to go back to California. So I came back to California. And, that was mid to late 70s into the 80s. As you know, back then, the economy, the world economy in the United States was booming, and everybody was making money and having a good time. So there I was, right in the middle of all that. And my father was in failing health, and I had to kind of work with him and take over a lot of his business things that he had left. So in an instant, I had to kind of reform from being a hippie to become a responsible first son in the family, first and only son of the family. Yeah. And life changed right there, another shift, right? And kind of dropped into the corporate world, which was very stressful. And I went through a lot of ups and downs there, and that kind of carried all the way into the 90s, right? And then I got married in the late 90s on a whim. And obviously when you get married on a whim, there's not a lot of substance, so that didn't last. But we parted as friends after 4 years. And, life kept going on. And I missed traveling again. So when I got into professional traveling and developed language skills to be able to work on the road. So I was on the road for sometimes 6 months at a stretch.
Wow.
Which I afford you not to have any kind of relationships whatsoever. But for my personal growth and enrichment, it was amazing. I've traveled most of the world. And again, this has really opened up my horizons as a human, and I think even before the word diversity was being coined, in conversation, I was already living that, back then. And, I think a lot of, again, people here in San Francisco and a lot of the JA friends that I did have, they always knew that I was an oddball, and that was kind of on the fringe, constantly on the fringe. And, they couldn't tack me down. They couldn't pigeonhole me anywhere. I said, yeah. Well, I don't want to be pigeonholed. That's not what I'm living here for. So in 2003 was a pretty interesting thing, just kind of circling back to my own identity. It was the first time I had attended a Kopani, a convention, Pan American Nikkei, in Bolivia. And it was the first time that I encountered Japanese immigrants who had immigrated to Latin America. And I felt amazing and immediate kinship with them. It's that we had the same enthusiasm for life. We were animated. We talked a lot. You know, we touched each other. We loved to sing. We loved to dance. And quite different from, you know, Japanese Americans tend to be a little more reserved and, you know, closer to sort of the Japanese upbringing. So I made a lot of friends there, and then developed those friendships and maintained those friendships to this day. And I've traveled many times down there, and I actually even considered moving at one time, but I just couldn't figure out a work situation that was practical for myself. But, you know, I think, again, this kind of carried me forward and just further altered, you know, my own self-perception of who I am. And with languages, when I was in the 80s, again, I traveled to the South Pacific many times. And so I have friends in French Polynesia, and that's where I learned French. I had a French girlfriend there for about a year. So with each expansion or interaction with a foreign culture, a little bit of that foreign culture I've taken and made part of myself, you know, in terms of values, emotions, and aesthetics, and food and music and things. So it's just this constant state process of self-enrichment that I really enjoyed through my life. Just, you know, kind of bringing it up to the current moment, you know, it's been an odyssey, because I think about my parents and what they would have thought of me and how I turned out. And when I was growing up, I would have been defined in Japanese terms as a furyo. Furyo is kind of a philanderer, kind of a wanderer, one who kind of piddles in this and piddles in that, and which I did. You know, I mean, I think in the Japanese context, I would be looked upon, you know, you should have shame, you should be embarrassed about, you know, you grew up that way. But in the same way, no, I said it's really created a very unique individual as who I am.
Yeah.
So I don't regret it. You know, I think my parents forgive me for how I've grown up, in that I've kind of turned it around. I think there's a period when I was kind of very, you know, selfish and self-indulged, you know, and I learned my lesson for that. I lost a lot of friends and I screwed up big time, you know, but I think sometimes the best lessons are ones that, you know, you fall into your own traps and you have to get out of, right?
Yeah.
And I'm still, you know, not perfect in any imagination or any stretch of the word, but I think I've improved enough to be able to say that I am a good person now. I'm much better than I used to be.
Well, and this is why you're the perfect person to give advice to my son, because it seems like you've lived a really interesting life.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, one of the interesting things that you were talking about is, I don't know how many people know it, but there's a big divide in the Japanese American community about those that were in camp versus those that weren't in camp, the families.
Right.
And, you know, like me, my mom was from Japan and my dad just was in camps. I'm able to straddle that line in ways that I think most Japanese Americans aren't. But I was going to say, to your story about coming to America, I actually had the opposite experiences always. My mom would always tell me I was Japanese. And then I'd go to Japan as a kid, and I'd be like, no, like, you know, people wouldn't treat me like Japanese. And so it was a very interesting, like, hearing your like opposite reaction. You know, hearing the opposite reaction was really interesting to see that, because then I'd be in Japan, I'm like, I'm not Japanese, and then I come to America, I'm like, I'm not American. You know, like I don't really know what I am, you know, but
I think, you know, that definition of, you know, Nikkei, okay, Nikkei, some people say, what's the difference between Nikkei and Japanese American? Well, Japanese American is a subset of being Nikkei. Nikkeis are, you know, people of Japanese ancestry born overseas. And that's really interesting. You mentioned the war and the internment, because both my parents, my mom grew up in Nebraska. Interesting enough, you know, my grandparents on my mother's side came just at the turn of the century. And, you know, California, there were a lot of Japanese families already here. And my grandfather says, no, I want more space. It's too crowded here. And then there was also prefectural, I mean, in terms of where you came from in Japan. There was sort of a competition and sometimes even animosity, you know, between people from the South and people from the North, and my grandparents from the North. And most people in California came from the South, you know, from Hiroshima, Wakayama. My parents came from Tohoku, you know, Fukushima and Miyagi. So my grandfather said, well, you know, fuck this, you know, I'm not going to hang out here. I'm going to go east. And he got a job on a railway. So he worked on a railway all the way to Colorado. And he got off in, I forgot, where the rail line spur ended. But he ended up in Greeley, Colorado, and he took the money that he had saved. And he was a good gambler, so he would gamble with his foreman and weekly take his money. And the gambler and the foreman says, another round, another round. He says, Grandpa says, you sure? He says, yeah, let's go, double up. So, at the end, the guy wouldn't play with him anymore because he kept taking his money. So he had a nice little pot, and he settled down and rented a piece of land. And he said, okay, now I'm going to need a wife. So he did the picture bride thing. And I still have a picture, the original picture of Grandma and Grandpa when he went to pick her up in Seattle. And in fact, he was late. He was late 2 days. And so my poor grandmother was there alone with not a penny in her pocket, the clothes on her back, and a change of underwear in a little bag. And that's all she had. So 2 white Christian church ladies took care of her for 2 days. And she just, poor thing. She never really talked about this, but I heard this from my aunt. And, she said, well, did I make a mistake coming all the way here? Where's this guy that, was supposed to be responsible and profess love, blah, 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 blah. And finally he shows up 2 days. And it turns out that along the way, he was stopped somewhere to drink and gamble. But he says, don't complain. I have more money now. So he picked her up, didn't apologize. They went to the photographer, got a picture taken, and they just jumped on a train and headed back to Colorado. And they started a family, and they ended up with 8 kids.
Wow.
Yeah. And on my father's side, he was here in California, but he actually should have been rounded up. But he was in the Monterey area, and he was always a real business entrepreneur. And he and some guys they were harvesting seaweed out of Monterey Bay and then driving it inland towards I think it was Watsonville or Salinas, and they were drying it out. They started making nori, and so they were down there. He got stopped, and they all got questioned. And my dad says, "Look," he says, "I'm American. I can help you guys." And I guess it was FBI or some government federal agent. He says, "What can you do?" He says, I speak Japanese. You guys need anybody who speaks Japanese. And just a stroke of luck, which is now the Monterey School for International Language Studies at that time in the war, was a military decoding center. So he got taken there, and he got a job decoding Japanese radio messages at night on shortwave. And that's how he kept his ass out of being taken to internment camp.
Yeah.
And so he got a special ID and was able to stay out of camp during the duration of the war. And he worked there and was still doing his little business on the side. The wakame nori industry didn't take off. They made a little money, but you know what? That was who he was, and he built. I'm going to digress here a little, but he really became a successful businessman. Part of that DNA, unfortunately, did not rub off on me, much to his huge disappointment. But he says, "Oh, you want to be an artist? Okay, well, you better do it on your own. I'm not gonna help you with that." I said, "Okay, that's fine. Let's just see and go from there." So, in terms of the family experience, it was really different. And I learned a lot about the internment with friends whose family went through internment, and I was been educated to that whole very traumatic experience, for people that went through, and I didn't go through that, so I had to learn it, right?
Yeah.
And luckily that Satsuki Ina is here in the Bay Area, and so there's she has a weekly Monday open discussion, and so it's usually at noon. So who's going to be in that conversation at noon? It's usually retired people, who are not working. Yeah. But I'm glad, that people are open and talking about this. Generational trauma has to be healed, and it has to end. And I think, the current generation, the 4th and 5th generation kids, need to understand it, but they shouldn't be carrying it forward. So
I think we'll always carry
digress on it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm a Yonsei, and my son's a Kosei, so we still talk about it. It's still
I think it's really to be aware of, but at the same time, I think it shouldn't be something like a cross to bear, but actually a serious and very, in the Japanese way, a source of empowerment, about inner strength, and that's really what carried us through.
Well, so I mean, what I tell my son
Yeah,
about the camp is always that it's not going to happen to Japanese again because we're a really small minority and we're
right,
allies with America. But at
right.
the same time, it's more about making sure it doesn't happen to anybody else. That
Exactly.
we can use our voice because our family has gone through this
Yep.
to make sure that it doesn't happen to a Muslim or Chinese or whoever else that people hate. And that we could say that our family went through it and it was terrible and that we should never let this happen and that that's our cross to bear is being a voice for preventing again,
That's
but not
right.
necessarily to feel bad about ourselves, but more about to be empowered to be able to
Exactly.
because what I tell people is that after 41, after Pearl Harbor, almost nobody came to the support of Japanese Americans.
Hmm.
But after 9/11, one of the first groups of people that spoke up, for Muslim Americans was the Japanese Americans. That we
Yeah.
made it. We had to we protested or we spoke out to make sure that what happened to us wouldn't happen to them as well. Even though
Right.
people, I don't think it was big, but people were saying that they should all be locked up. They should be sent out of
Mm.
the country or whatever. And it's like,
Mm.
no, that's like the same path that we went. But we should get into some advice. So let's hear
Sure.
some advice from you, and then we'll see how that goes.
Okay. All right. It's interesting for me. Like I said, I grew up as a furio from under. I mean, being asked in a position to give advice.
No, that's the best. You're the best kind of
Yeah.
person to give advice.
Yeah. And I think, I'm going to give advice from that standpoint of
Yeah.
everything that I've been through. So one of the first thing I say that to always tell your kids to live life with an open mind, make friends with everybody, because that we are all basically the same, regardless of how we appear and what language we speak. And I think the younger that starts in encouraging them, to be that way, the better off we are. Number two, this is
Well,
something that, whoops, I'm
actually, back
sorry.
to your number one.
Yeah.
How do you think you should go about? How do you go about doing that every day? Or I mean, what are some methods in order to make that happen?
Yeah, I think right now with the current, COVID lockdown, it's difficult. But
Yeah.
I was always taken to playgrounds where there's all kind of kids, and in fact, my first experience, one of the weird discriminational thing was kind of like getting it from both sides, was one good friend that I had in fourth grade. That was like 2 years after I got to the United States, was African American, right? And so this poor guy, in class, he was the only African American in the class. And we met actually just playing after school because nobody would select him to be on a kickball team. And I said, yeah, come on, Henry, just play with us, And he kind of just brightened up and smiled. And then he told me, thank you, And I said, what do you mean, thank you? He says, nobody wanted to play with me, but you asked me to play. I said, yeah, man. I mean, whatever, you're one of us. And I think that came from when I was even younger, when I was back in Japan and when I was in kindergarten. I could have gone, I started out in a Japanese nursery school, then went to kindergarten. But in kindergarten, I was in an environment with kids from all over the world. And my parents really, had to work hard to pay to go to the school because it was private, but they said it was important for me to understand the world and everybody in it. And that starts off with you engaging with kids from all over. That way you understand that we're pretty much the same. So that's kind of, I think is a really important process. And also watching, if you can watch, well, now I guess watching movies, kids watch, there's a lot of things out there. I haven't really explored watching kids TV programming, but kids and programs that show, foreign kids in foreign cultural environments, they may eat different things and they may do different things, but basically they have a mom and dad, they have a certain order and a certain decorum in which they have to live. Certain common rules of decency, I think, are universal, So the more they kind of see that they may look different and speak a different language and their skin's a different color, but they're behaving and acting and doing things the same, the more it becomes familiar and the more it's less of a threat, the more you keep growing up with this open mind of acceptance. Yeah. I think that's where my experience was, and I'm very grateful for that, really grateful, and I couldn't understand when I came to the States that there was so much intolerance, and from white people and Japanese Americans too,
Yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, I was like Henry in a lot of ways. I was castigated. I played a lot by myself because of that, you know. And even at that young age, you know, if you start mouthing off about things like that, you know, kids will gang up on you. I say, oh, you're weird, man. You know, you're not like us. I said, well, why would I want to be, right? Bam.
Well, I have a lot of more faith in the kids of this generation.
Yes,
because they're, you know,
absolutely.
even my son, we were looking at snowman decorations.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Daddy, that's not a snowman, that's a snow person. And I was like, oh, okay. Like,
how old is he now?
He's 9.
He's 9. Oh,
but I was like, oh,
scary.
sorry, I'm being gendered. I'm being gendered for the snow person. But it was just, but it's not, you know, that's not the only thing. I mean, like, even when he was in, you know, like I had friends who had kids, and they were like, you know, they had transgender kids in their class,
right?
You know, and like when I was a kid, being gay was bad, right? Like, you couldn't be gay in school. But now, you know, like, now it's not as big of a deal, I think, for these kids, and they're a lot more open to different races and different cultures. I mean, you know, like before, when I was a kid, even, you know, like, sushi was weird, Japanese food was weird, anything that wasn't peanut butter sandwich was weird, right? But now, like, you know, now, like, these kids want to eat authentic food. Like, nobody believes that Del Taco is, well, a lot of people don't believe Del Taco is like real Mexican food, right? They actually know what it really tastes like, and they want real food, not this. I mean, like, it's okay to have hybrid food, but it's still, like, they understand that that's not traditional Japanese food. I mean, like, look at ramen. Ramen is super popular now. Remember, ramen used to just be instant ramen for most people.
Yep.
Right? Now, like, they want authentic ramen by the authentic Japanese chefs or whatever.
Well, that's good. That is good. So let me ask you something. Does your son like to read?
He loves to read.
Is he a reader? Yeah, that's good, because there are actually such great kids books out there now that, you know, speak to a lot of current issues, but kind of interpret it to the young mind. And that's so important. You know, I mean, I wish that, well, we didn't have those tools because that was a generational thing, but I think moving forward, the more of that, you know, is generated, and the more kids are compelled to read and, you know, just stay away from external stimulation, electronic stimulation, the better. When I was, unfortunately, you know, I remember the Screen Actors Guild, but they used to have a program called Book Pals, and they killed it just out of no reason from the head office in LA. And there were 20 of us in the Bay Area, and we used to travel to different primary schools and read to students. And I got to tell you, you know, there was a lot of work, and because there's not a lot of work for actors in the Bay Area, but we really loved doing it, you know, and we would role play, and we would get the kids to come up and read with us. And there's just some magic that happens when you get kids involved to listen to reading, as opposed to, you know, something visual or something audio or electronic, right? And you really see that you've touched something inside of them that piques their curiosity and compels them to actually want to read. And then before this program was canceled, we did an essay exercise where I had little kids actually write their own stories about, you know, various subjects about who I want to be, or who am I? Who am I was really fascinating. I got amazing responses. I don't want to go into it, but the magic, I think there's the formidable years of child growth, you know, and if you can plant these seeds during those years, is the most important thing to, you know, affect their change and how they grow and what they're stimulated in the future.
Definitely.
So
let's hear your next piece of advice.
Next piece, number 2. I started out to say my dad stressed this all the time, because it's something that he kind of broke with traditional Japanese upbringing. As bushy as he was, as a samurai, hard-ass, discipline-obsessed father as he was, he said, you have to question authority. I said, well,
wow, that's super not Japanese.
I know, and I said, why are you telling me that after you used to summarily beat me, you know, try to beat things into me to make me understand? He says, because in this country, the white man's making the rules, and you have to question the rules. You know, he says, otherwise we can't get ahead. So that was a really interesting conversation I had with him. And that was when I was about 13, and I was getting into this rebellious adolescent stage, you know, and everything that he told me, I said no to, because, you know, I mean, it's old school, trying to cram something down your throat, and, you know, and the natural reaction is to reject it.
Yeah.
Especially when I see that the person who's trying to do the stuffing down the throat is a hypocrite in a lot of ways. I don't want to go in that side conversation, but you know, it was really something that actually made me become get involved in political activism. I think, you know, that was a trigger. Even though he didn't support my political activism because he was basically conservative, I wouldn't think he was a diehard Republican, but he was a businessman. So, you know, he coming from the school of economic nuts and bolts and sense, and you only do things that are logical. You know, you don't deal with etheria, you don't deal with theory or philosophy, you just deal with practical survival. So that was number two. Number three, I think the most important thing is to allow and to encourage your kids to freely explore their slightest interest, no matter how small it is. Always take interest in what they're doing. You know, whether, let's say they pick up a bug in the air and say, oh my God, look at this. Do you think, how does this bug grow? I said, well, would you like to find out more about that? You know, so these things, because a lot of times parents, you know, kind of in their rush will kind of squash a child's enthusiasm about something. Yeah. They'll start imparting their own values on the kid and saying, well, I don't think that's worth it. Why do you want, I don't think that's good for you to get involved in, you know, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's like my father telling me, why do you want to be an artist? You need to be a businessman. You know, you need to make money and make decisions and be responsible. I said, well, artists are responsible. They make good art. He goes, I don't think so. So that's really important because, you know, that's sort of a very delicate point, you know, and you can kind of, if you're not careful, you can actually extinguish something before it even starts. So, discouraging. Yeah. And I think that's a parental issue, you know, discouraging your kids because of backward parental mindset can be a real big negative.
Yeah, because that's a really hard one. Because, for example, my son loves video games, and I don't want him to play a lot of video games because I think he should be outside or he should be reading and doing other stuff. So it's he'll say, "Well,
have you ever asked him what he gets out of playing? I mean, is he actually engaging with the process? Is only in the process, or is he into the story?"
No,
I haven't had this conversation with any kids, so I'm kind of curious myself.
I mean, I think, it's me. What video games are like TV, or they're very addictive. Like they know how to, you know, know how to give you enough rewards.
Yeah.
And so you want to keep doing it. And like, you know, it's very like to me, the way I look at it is that it's very, it's something that it's meant to suck you in, like social media too, right? Social media is meant to like keep getting you come back and get you to like and post and do more and more. And so, you know, I wouldn't say I'm like, you know, you can't play any video games. My thing is like, we have to put it within reason, right? You can't spend 8 hours in a day playing video games. Like, you know, there's schoolwork, there's sports, there's just being a kid, you know, playing games. But
like you said, getting outside and engaging with nature. Yeah. I mean, there's so much to learn from, you know, going somewhere and just enjoying silence, you know. I mean, just appreciate silence and just subtle sounds and
but it is difficult. I mean, to your point of, you know, extinguishing, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, how do I, you know, the challenge for me is always, I don't want to put my dreams on somebody else.
Yeah.
So like, you know, I don't want to push something that's my dream, not his.
Right.
So that's how I have to constantly check myself, is to make sure that it's that you want to do it. Like, you know, he wants to do it, not I want him to do it.
That's right. Exactly.
And that's a really hard line because, you know, like, you know, my dreams are done, you know, I'm just, you know, like I'm already adult. And so, you know, we're in different places. So I think that's a challenge. And I think a lot of the older parents from back in the day, like they didn't have that conundrum. They're just like, my dreams are your dreams, right? So, but
let me ask you. So I'm curious. Does he talk about his friends and what he, you know, talks about with his friends about? I mean, does he open up that much? A lot of times kids won't do that. They'll just say, "Oh, well, why do you want to?" You know, you wouldn't understand anyway. Right?
They
depends on the kid.
Yeah. I think it depends on the friendships. Like boys and boys are different than boys and girls. They're different. So, I don't. They talk about weird stuff that I have no idea what they're talking about usually.
Yeah. I think. Okay. Let me finish my advice points here. So, you know, I'm going to keep it really simple. I think, you know, another thing that I was taught was always to be kind and respectful to all living things, not just people, but animals, plants, in environments because they all have feelings, you know. And then he may think, what are you talking about? Does a plant have feelings? I said, yes, they do. I read that series of a book. He's a German forester, and it's called The Secret Life of Trees.
Okay.
I just read that during the lockdown. I was blown away, and I read all of his books. I never knew that plants take care of each other. You know, for instance, there's a grove of trees and one tree is not doing well, that the other trees will actually send nutrients through the roots in the ground to try to take care of their sick tree brethren.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of opened my mind up too. And then the last one is, very altruistic, but I think is always to be faithful to your friends, family, and especially yourself. You forget about being your own best friend, because you yourself sometimes are your own worst enemy, you know, and that starts from childhood. I remember it really well, you know, and can't remember exactly what triggered it, but just, you know, important the parent to encourage. Yeah. You know, getting back to the other point about any little thing about interest is to always bring about, have them talk about it. You know, why are you interested in that? You know, and just to always have them to believe in themselves, you know, and that leads to, I think, happiness, you know, and self-contentment, you know.
That elusive happiness.
Yeah, elusive happiness. Yeah, and how do you define that? I mean, that discussion could go on for years.
For sure.
So I kind of want to talk about one other thing, something that really has kind of altered, I think, my life was back in 2015. I joined a community writers group.
Okay.
And I was invited to join, and first I said, well, why do I want to do this? Yeah, and I kind of trickled in there. My first piece, I still have my first piece. It was pretty lame, but since then I've been writing quite a bit, and a lot of it is family history, but also I've kind of departed into writing fiction right now. And a lot of it was started with Japanese being what it is to be Japanese American and Japanese experience. And I couldn't write about camp because, like I told you, I didn't have any experience about camp, but I wrote about, you know, being an immigrant. And it's kind of evolved to now that I want to writing more about things that are about a universal human condition. So I don't want to be pigeonholed as being an Asian American writer. You know, I mean, by identity, yes, ethnicity I am, but I want to write things that have a little more universal appeal. Mm-hmm. So the latest, actually, I'll send you a piece that I wrote.
I'd love to read it. Yeah, definitely.
And it was actually my memories back of my great auntie who lived on Pennsylvania Avenue, right about a block from the Evergreen Cemetery.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And her husband. And so I kind of set it there. And it's titled Miguelito. It's about how one evening it's a summer night in present tense, and you know, it's a lot of noise, and you hear typical urban noises at night. You hear gunshots, you hear police helicopters, and
wait, when is this set?
Mm-hmm.
When is this set?
This is set in contemporary. This is in present time.
Got it. Okay.
So Oji-chan has to go take the garbage out, and he goes down and he sees the garbage can moving, and he jumps back and he freaks out, and he thinks, oh, well, the cats or the raccoons are in the garbage can again. And he opens up the lid, and there's a little boy inside.
Oh, no.
And so the whole story is about this little boy who had escaped and made it across the border alone, traveling all the way from El Salvador.
Wow.
And the protagonist, Oji-chan, used to work for the Department of, I think it's Interior Agriculture. And this is kind of like my second cousin who worked in Brawley in the Imperial Valley during the Braceros program. So he spoke Spanish, right?
Yeah.
And so he finds out this little boy had come across the border with his younger brother, but lost his brother on the way. So I'll send you the story.
Wait, is this a novel or a short story?
It's just a short story, but eventually, I mean, the Odyssey continues. And then I wrote the second installment about him, how the little boy, he leaves the home. The couple wake up the next morning, he's gone. And he left a little note saying, thank you for your kindness. But he decides he needs to find his little brother.
Oh, wow.
So he walks from Boyle Heights over into LA into Skid Row.
Oh, no.
And then the next chapter of the story starts with a character that I kind of thought about. It would be me if I totally hit the shits and ended up on the street as homeless, right? A Vietnam, a Sansei Vietnam vet living in a tent on 2nd Street. And he wakes up and he gets up in the morning and he sees these 2 little feet sticking out from underneath the blanket. And it's Miguelito had snuck in there in the middle of the night. And so there's a whole relationship develops there between Kaz and Miguelito.
Wow.
And the Odyssey. So he's looking for his little brother. So it's kind of an ongoing thing, but I'm kind of, I kind of see this, I would like to see this as like a short film, So
wow.
that's kind of what I'm working on now. And part of it kind of jumped out from that time we did with East Side Sushi, and East Side Sushi was such a great experience. I mean, it was almost premature. I wish it would have come out in 2016 because it was about, really about immigrant self-determination, right?
Sure, yeah.
And I got an email from a friend who was traveling in Tel Aviv, Israel. They said it was showed in the movie theater in Tel Aviv, Israel. I said, wow, that was awesome.
I think it's on Netflix now.
Yeah, it's on Netflix, and it was we got stuck as as a very popular category on Netflix, and we're right next to the biography of Bruce Lee. So we're in good company.
That's hilarious.
But that was such a great experience, And again, I liked it because it kind of also showed a microcosm of conflict within the immigrant community. Here you have Japanese immigrant and Latina. And we found commonality because we understand that we're all on the same struggle, And
that's always my biggest struggle with Japanese Americans is that they've forgotten that they're immigrants or their families were once immigrants. A lot of them. I mean, even when I worked at the museum, Japanese American National Museum, I get calls from people telling me how, oh, these Mexicans, they're here illegally. They're so different than us. I'm like, really? Like your grandparents or great grandparents came here probably illegal, might have come here illegally. They didn't speak English, people are saying the same stuff about them as they said about these people here. Like you just forgot about it because it's been like 3 generations or 2 generations. And that was always the most frustrating because my mom was Japanese. I had that, I still had that immigration. Like I spoke from a mom, when we went to the post office or something, and I had all that, but I also had the camp stuff. But that was always the most frustrating thing with the community stuff. I just like, man, it's not that long. Like don't tell me that like about the Mexican illegals. Like don't tell me about that because like they said the same shit about you guys, like about us. Like, not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. But that's been really frustrating to hear.
My mom's younger sister, she married. Her husband was 442 vet, and he was a medic, and didn't make it. He came back and he lived till 94.
Oh wow!
But he was telling me stories about within the ranks. He was 442 mainland, man, making the guys from the 100th, and just even within. That's why they used to get into fist fights, until the Hawaiian boys found out about what camp was all about. It kind of totally shut them up. But I'm talking about, Japanese Americans in denial. I dated this girl back in like 1987, and she was from a really wealthy JA family from Orange County. And so she says, why don't you come and meet my parents? I said, okay, we're gonna meet your parents, So we went out. I was like this big palatial house, and oh my God, if I closed my eyes and just listened to all of them, I thought I was walked into a Anglo-Saxon household, and we had dinner, and it was like, this old Holly food, right? And I said, you guys ever eat Japanese? He said, oh, we don't eat Japanese food. It's just, we don't relate to that at all. I kind of was like, oh, and it was interesting to see people with that mindset. And
well, I think a lot of it's camp related, right?
Right. Well, they were in where they were in Poston, Arizona, but still, like you said, they speak disparagingly about the help, right? And they had a Mexican woman who was the maid, right?
Yeah.
And I could tell the poor maid, she kind of walks in with her head lowered, and so she walked by beside of me, and I said, hola, And she kind of brightened up for a minute, but then the mother kind of stared her down and she kind of dropped her head again.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see Japanese Americans that were obviously successful. They had so-called arrived and lived, in extreme upper middle class luxury. But it's just what happened, they sort of extinguished, the certain part of their humanity by disengaging themselves as, we weren't part of that, immigrant thing. And I mean, it's.
Well, that's like the first time I went to Janum,
Yeah.
because I was never around Japanese Americans. And the first time I went to Janum, I'm like, wait, these are Japanese people? Like I was like, there's no Japanese here at all.
Yeah.
They're just American.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to kind of start to see and understand, that like for a lot of the community, it was like, be American or be in jail, right? And so they chose being American, but that meant that there's like this huge part of them that they don't understand, and like I even got this huge discussion with somebody about how they were using "shikataganai" wrong because they didn't understand it. They say it means something, and I'm like, well, kinda, but you don't understand the meaning of it because you're just saying like the definition of it, but there's more to it. Like it's that loss of like culture, that is really sad.
Yeah,
and
I mean, it's not a term of resignation, definitely.
Yes,
it's not about resignation.
But I think
which they use it though.
Yeah, that's how they use it. Yeah, and I'm like, that's not what they mean by it, right? That's not. It's totally. I mean, yes, it means that, but not the way you are explaining it. But yeah, so. Wow, this has been really interesting. I love your advice, and I think your advice is really great. And I think it's the kind of advice that my son should definitely be hearing. So I really appreciate it. And where can people follow you? Where can people see some of this stuff?
I don't
social media.
I only have, Facebook, but even that, I don't put a lot of private stuff on there. I mean, people say, well, why don't you start your own blog? And I say, well, yeah, one of these days, I think, I don't know if anybody's interested in pursuing working with me to develop some of my stories into screenplays. I would be very interested in doing that. So they can find me on Facebook, Roji Oyama. You can message me there.
Yeah,
that's the only place. I don't do a lot of social media. I get kind of fatigued by it.
Sure. You're not on TikTok doing the newest dance?
Well, yeah, and I work with my hands. I build things, so I'd much rather be doing that. I'm doing craft work and being outside and being on the water, and engaging with nature. That's more what I like to be doing. But obviously with this lockdown, it's a reset. So I'm looking forward to developing more of that craft. Actually, speaking of going back, they're working on collecting. We submitted for a piece for the fourth anthology that we've published. So we've got 4 anthologies out since 2015.
Wow!
And I'll send you the link. I can't remember. They just changed the Facebook link for the writers group. Yes,
I'll put it in the show notes for everybody.
I don't know if you remember Shizue Siegel.
Yeah.
I think I'm trying to kind of introduce you, but you're both busy and trying to get connected. So she's the one I want to thank for inspiring me to start writing back in 2015.
Yeah.
And she's also the editor and the collaborator and the fundraiser for this project. So bless her heart, she's really knocking her socks off right now. And so I will send you all the links and the titles of the anthologies. I don't know if we have them available in LA. There was that one bookstore that's in Little Tokyo, but it's sort of over kind of in a little small shopping center. Actually, Naomi Hirahara had a reading there. I can't remember the name of the bookstore.
Is it in the Weller Court, Kunikuya? Or Kuni?
No, it wasn't a Kinokuniya. It was a different store. But anyway, I'll source it out. So
send over. I'd love to see it, and obviously, I'd love to read your writing. I'm super curious to read it, but I didn't realize you were writing.
After all these years, I'm kind of lazy, but I finally managed to put them into a Google Drive. So I have a lot of my stories in there, and I'll send them on to you.
Perfect. I'd love to see it.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And
great.
See you next week. Bye, guys.
Okay.